So this is the general title is Impacts of Climate Change on Forests. I have a very specific approach. This is an ecological economic perspective. So I'm an economist, but we sometimes dig a bit deeper into ecology, mostly when it comes to the modeling of forest ecosystems. It was perfect, but now let's see. Yeah, so I need to click on that. Okay, so that is a bit the structure. So I will start with a view on what does climate change to European forests from an economic point of view. So this is, I'll take a bit more time on that because this is how I try to explain how we approach this very complex question. I will then move to another topic that is also an output of a research training group that we had over 9 years that was dealing with the conservation of forest biodiversity, and we were taking the economic part on that. I will also introduce a bit how we try to move away from deterministic to more robust decisions in terms of managing forests. And then the third part is a totally different one. That's a project that we conducted in Central America. So here we looked into impacts of climate change on tropical forests, tropical productivity, also plantations, impacts on ecosystem services. And the last part is a very actionable part. I will give you a very brief introduction into an upcoming international research training group that we have together with partners here in Canada. So Frédéric is one of the PIs there. I'm one of the PIs. It's coordinated by my colleague Thomas Seifert and by Brigitte Leblanc from Lakehead here. So that is a bit the plan. I hope that I can stick within the 45 minutes, but you can interrupt me at any time. So if there's anything that you don't understand that you want to know, you just stop, yeah, and then I get in. Okay, let's go for the first part. The basis of this, that was also a result of a big European project that I have been coordinating about 15 years ago with 25 partners of 20 countries in Europe. And the basis is a plot system that has been installed already in the 1990s on the European level, about 6,000 plots distributed over the whole of Europe, including 140 tree species. We were concentrating on the main tree species. And the idea behind that was what happens to our main tree species in Europe. You see, we have a large climatic gradient here reaching from the very south of Europe, southern part of Portugal, Spain, very dry, very hot areas, to the very north, Scandinavia, Norway, Finland. And that's, we wanted to know what happens to the tree species. This is a plot system where basically the health status of the trees is being observed every year. And we used it to set up a large scale so-called species distribution model. So we wanted to predict the probability under which climate conditions can which tree species occur. So what you need is, beside this information of presence, absence of species, you need, of course, climate scenarios. This is a very tough scenario, A1FI, under the fourth assessment report. I mean, this was back in 2010 when we did that. You see the warming over the months here in terms of anomalies. So especially in the summer months, especially in the southern and central part of Europe, we were expecting increases of temperature up to 6-7 degrees. And the same with precipitation. So blue means wetter, red, orange means drier. And you see during the vegetation time, I mean, this is mostly temperate and Mediterranean forests. So between May and September, we're expecting, according to this tough scenario, quite severe droughts. And what did we do then? We set up this species distribution model that has been done by my colleague, Niklas Zimmermann from Switzerland, where I've been working at the time being You see, this is one of the main species that we put a lot of hope in this species. This is an oak that is, let's say, assumed to be, well, more or less stable to drought, also to a bit of climate change, Quercus robur, pedunculous oak. And you see the black dots. This is where we found the species in the data set, and there is a high concentration. You see these probability maps in France, a bit also more to the eastern part of Europe, in southern England, northern Spain. And now what did we do? We applied our climate scenarios. So this is the current climate, 1950 to 2000. And you see what's happening if you apply the climate scenarios. You see the species moving from the southwest to the northeast, and in 2100 under around +6 scenarios, this species that we thought would be rather climate stable would totally disappear from Central Europe and would be hiding into Sweden, even Finland, where it doesn't occur nowadays. Yeah, so there is a movement towards that. You see also the northern British Isles. So this is one of the, let's say, for ecologists, this is a bad news, yeah, because what is the alternative? Now, a further bad news is for economists, if we look at the most economic species, and this is this one here, watch out for the little picture there. So this is our most economic species, the backbone of the timber industry, more or less in the whole of Europe. You see the present distribution of Novae spruce, Picea abies. You see there is quite some presence according to the data set in Central Europe around, you see nicely distributed around the Carpathian Mountains, and a massive showing up in Scandinavia. That's a major tree species still there. And again, we did the same game. So we applied the climate scenario, the tough climate scenario, and you see what's happening. It's also disappearing, and it's basically at 2100. It's more or less only concentrated on the very northern part of Scandinavia, northern parts of Sweden and Norway, but even in Finland, we wouldn't find it anymore, except maybe some very northern parts of Karelia. And you see a very small distribution. This is very high up in the Alps, but we are not sure even if it's able to climb up there, because I mean, the soil is very shallow there. Development of soils takes ages. It's never going into 100 years. So that is a bit what we see from the main trees is they are basically moving towards the north, the northeast, to more humid, to cooler conditions under climate change. I mean, we will lose a lot about that. Now we continued here and looked into the whole of Europe for all the tree species that we had in our data set. And what we did was we grouped them into the 7 main groups. So the green ones, this is the beech, the European beech. You see the small picture. Then we have the Novae spruce. We have then 2 oak species. The one that is also this a bit yellowish one, that is the productive oaks, Quercus robur, that I showed you. Then we have a productive pine species, Scots pine, Pinus silvestris. But then we also have in the data set already very drought and warm adapted species like this Mediterranean oak. So Quercus suber, Quercus ilex, so tree species, but you see the forests are completely different. Yeah, these are not the dense forests. The trees reach maybe 10, 12 meters of height. So this is not a tree that we can sell on the market. You can do some firewood out of it. Yeah, and the blue ones you see in the very humid and cold areas, we would expect beech as a dominating species. Behind that picture, this is the current climate, 1950 to 2000, is already an economic model. The economic model is we have divided the whole of Europe into small pixels of roughly 700 times 700 meters, 50 hectares. And for each pixel, we calculated the probability that the species occurs or not. You set a cut point. If the cut point is exceeded, it's there. If not, it's not there. And for each of the species of the pixels, we decided if the more economic species would be there, we put it there. If not, we went down to the next one. And you see, this is a bit the picture. So this is a potential distribution of trees in Europe. And you see, when you look at the size of these pictures, this is roughly about equivalent to the share that the species would take on these, let's say, 150 to 200 million hectares of forests in Europe. So we would see 30% would be covered under the current climate with Norway spruce. You see that around the mountains in Central Europe, a lot in Scandinavia. You see that beech, European beech, would be the dominant species around Germany, but also parts of France. But you would see that the productive oaks would be very much distributed in France, but also in Eastern Europe, so Hungary, Romania. But what you also see is that already under the current climate, there is regions in Europe that are only suitable for these very drought and heat adapted species, like this Mediterranean oaks. And then we found a second pine species, Mediterranean pine species, Pinus halepensis, Aleppo pine, that would be around the Mediterranean, southern Italy, parts of Greece. So that is the picture that we would expect if we apply to our model the current climate. And now again, we applied quite a tough climate scenarios in two variations. So let's say a mean variant of the 2100 climate change scenarios, and then an extreme one. And watch out a bit if the size of these small pictures, if they increase, we're expecting an increase of the share of these species. So today, 30% spruce, maybe 20% pine, 15% of beech, a bit less oak, the oak 2 around 10%. And now you see what happens, 2100 under a mean climate scenarios. A mean means plus 4 degrees, about A1B in that case. You would see that around 40% of the whole of Europe would only be suitable for these Mediterranean oaks, also for these Mediterranean pines. Spruce being really very much pushed already, in that case, back to Scandinavia. You would still have about the same share of European beech, but totally translocated to the eastern part of Europe, so none in France anymore. And we would even have an increase of the productive oaks, so pedunculous oaks, but also moved to the east. And what you see when you look into countries like France or Italy also, that would be completely covered by this Mediterranean oak vegetation. So no more, let's say, whatsoever productive species. And then if we look into the extreme scenarios, it's getting even worse. So this would be a picture under a +6 degree scenario for Europe, roughly 60% of the whole continent only being covered by Mediterranean oak forest. You see the forest like that. So in Spain, you would call that a dehesa. So that is an agricultural system where you basically can grow some trees and below you would have some pigs or so, but it's not really a dense forest. You would see very little spruce, maybe less than 10%. Scots pine almost extincted, 2 to 3%. Yew beech completely, let's say, away into northern Great Britain around the Alps. And yes, some oak left, but into Scandinavia. So that is the extreme, let's say, change, vegetation change under an extreme climate. And now what we did was we wanted to know what does it mean in terms of economics. So how does the value of this forest, the production value, changes when we apply these extreme scenarios? So we published a paper in Nature Climate Change now, 2013, where we came up with figures like this is a loss of production value between 100 and 300 billion euros, on this forest area. I will come back a bit on the details how we did that. We were harshly criticized for that. So people in Italy were saying, this is all wrong. This is extreme. This is a model. it's quite a large figure, but just what we observed is that. So we have a constant decrease under all different variants of the scenarios for the productive species like spruce, pine 1, and we have an increase of the non-productive one. So what we did was we used a large-scale scenario model to have the productivity behind. So that is a model that is based on national forest inventory data that basically projects the development of the trees over time. Under different also management scenarios, we took out basically the standing volume and the growing stock and the net annual increment, and then we applied a very standard economic model that is a land expectation value that we calculated to see for these different periods. There's not so much of a change, but what you see is there's a huge difference between the productive one that is mostly Norway spruce, that is 3 to 4 times higher than all the others. The second one, slightly better than the other, is pine 1. And then what you see is when you look into oak 2, this is basically non-productive forestry there. Yeah, you can produce maybe some, let's say, firewood, but not really wood that could be used on an industrial basis. And if you combine then these two approaches, then you get this. This is the final land expectation, the change of the land expectation value. So you see at 2010 on the price cost relations of 2010, we had roughly 3,500 euros as land expectation value in the mean, very much dominated by the Norway spruce. The deciduous trees very little contribute to that. And then this goes down in the mean from 3,500 to 2,500. And so if you have 200 million hectares of forest, you multiplied with 1,000 euros of loss, you get these 200 billion euros of loss. In the extreme case, if you look here, the arrows, that is the uncertainty, that is only the climate uncertainty, so different representations of climate scenarios in different modeling chains. You see there is quite a high uncertainty. So in the worst case, we would lose up to 50% of forest, which would get up then here, not 200, but 300, 350 billion euros of loss.
Marc, il y a une question en ligne.
Sorry?
Il y a une question en ligne.
Okay.
Ah,
Yeah,
c'était...
yeah, please ask. Yeah.
Ouvre ton micro.
Hi, sorry to disturb you. I was wondering, your research is really interesting, and to understand how you did it, I wonder what are the input, the action that you put in your model to come to those conclusions. I think there's a lot of element that you must have put in there.
Yes, there's quite a lot. I mean, the management, there are standard management schemes behind in this, if you send in this scenario model. This is basically the standard forest management that has taken place in the past that we continued to the future. There's prices and costs of the year 2010, you see that. And the land expectation value is a form of a net present value. So this is an interest rate of 2% we assumed here. We did, of course, a lot of variance studies. I mean, in general, this net present value, if you increase the interest rate, the net present value goes down and vice versa. If you decrease the interest rate, it goes up. Yeah. So these are the main, let's say, management assumptions. In the model itself, there is the presence and absence of the tree species of the plot. And there is the variation of the climate variables that explain this presence or absence. So that is the general approach of this. So it's a combination of a species distribution model with a standard economic model that depicts the productivity. Okay? Okay. So 200 billion, 300 billion euros, the people were really had a hard time to believe, oh, that's exaggerated. Just a glimpse what happened in, so that is an article in a practitioner's journal that we published in the aftermath of the extreme droughts that we had from 2018 to 2020, 3 years of drought, only on a very small area in Germany, maybe on less than 10 million hectares. We had a registered damage of 13 billion euros, due to bark beetle attacks, mostly in Novis Pros. So I think that we are probably, with these large figures, we are still probably underestimating the real damage that we are expecting over this long term. And we must not forget that we are only talking about timber. So there is no kilogram of carbon that has been evaluated. I mean, we lost a lot of carbon here in these 3 or 5 years after 2018. There is no other ecosystem service that has been evaluated. So we must not forget, when we talk about money, we underestimate it. Also, the people don't want to see it. Good. So this was the first part. If there's no direct question to that one, I would switch then to the second part. The second part is the result of a research training group that was called CONFOBI, Conservation of Forest Biodiversity, in Central Europe. A research training group, I will present this later, and the last part is we get a financing for a group of PhDs working together, in this case over a period of 9 years, so 3 generations of students, 12 students, from different angles looking into one topic. And this one topic was conservation of forest biodiversity. We took the economic part here, but we also did, of course, some modeling, but there were many others. So there are people looking into birds, into bats, into plants, of course, into forest growth, into silviculture. So our approach was, again, we set up, in that case, a process-based model to project, let's say, the development of forest ecosystem. And we looked into ecosystem services, into synergies and trade-offs between ecosystem services. We had also a social science part where stakeholders were interviewed on their perceptions. And the idea was also we had a climate change impact here that we looked into. We looked into uncertainties related to climate change. So that was the general approach. There's one PhD that came out of that by Andrei Augustinczyk. Now 4 years ago, he published quite some papers on that, and I will just give a very short glimpse into what came out there. So what we did was we started with what is the cost of retention forestry. Retention forestry, you basically take out parts of the productive forest out of the productivity. In that case, we had 2, the dark green ones were existing forest reserves. We wanted to connect these by establishing new forest reserves. This is a lighter green, and then the bluish one, a connecting corridor. And we looked into, and what we found at the first stage of this, that it was not so much that you have to give up if you do it carefully, if you select it carefully. It was roughly about 4% of the net present value, yet let me lose mostly by an increase of deadwood, by an increase of habitat trees, but that is not something that really impacts a lot. The problem here is how to really connect these different deadwood islands. So here we have this connecting corridor, and we placed in this connecting corridor deadwood islands to get one. This is in an indicator species, a red listed beetle, a stag beetle as we call it, are quite big. And you see even that doesn't cause a lot of, I would say, economic costs if you do this carefully. However, there is one problem. This is a very idealized model. It doesn't take into account any type of, let's say, disturbances or damages, any type of uncertainty. So that is a deterministic model. Yeah, it's based on graph theory. You just choose the optimal distance between these different deadwood islands, so that this dispersal distances of these stags, so how long they can fly, is really being kept. The thing is, when you include multiple uncertainties in such an idealized model, so we included here a climate uncertainty by using different climate scenarios applied to that. We include sort of a parameter uncertainty in this process-based model. The process-based models, they really they include a lot of different parameters, and each of them includes itself an uncertainty. And of course, if you include economics in such a game, you get a lot of different uncertainties. We try to analyze them. You see these violin graphics showing this is how you produce a probability density function, and then you look into, let's say, different parameters of the function and calculate some sort of uncertainty. You see that the main uncertainties issue from the economic part, prices and costs can change. The interest rate is something that you basically cannot predict. You have to do this on a variant analysis, and you have some model analysis. So overall, you have a lot of different uncertainties related to that. And if you apply that then to this, let's say, management problem by using, let's say, this red-listed insects, this species, you see that there's quite a difference to this deterministic solution that is on the left side without uncertainties. And on the right side, that would be what we call a robust solution. A robust solution is something that also can take into account, let's say, worst case scenarios in terms of climate, but also in terms of volatility of prices. You see that our management strategies and our management problem is getting by far more complex. Yeah, so you need much more of these Deadwood Islands, and you need to distribute them in a different pattern over the landscape, because you will lose some of them due to disturbances. And you see, this is something that was for us the most, let's say, critical here. So when you design on a very stylized, theoretical way, this type of management strategies, you have to move away from this more simplistic solutions that are deterministic to the robust solutions. And of course, this has a much higher economic impact.
What's the change in percentage in conservation between the two?
I think on the left side, we are far beyond these 10%, 5%. On the right side, you would clearly get into the 2-digit. So you have to give up more than, let's say, 10%, 15%. Very much depends which of the scenario you take into account. So it's quite considerable. Yeah, you need to have much more of these Deadwood Islands. You have to take out of the production much more than before. You see that here. Yeah, so it's quite considerable. Yeah, just another picture here. So here I met Philippe at an uneven age management conference. So we also included different management activities, different management styles. So here we had even two selection forest variants here included. You see on the left side, this is a pattern of management strategies, very much dominated by a single type of selection forest. On the right side, this would be the robust one. And when you see the black variants here, this is a no management. So no management means we have to take much more out of the production of these forests. So that is a clear difference. So when you take into account mostly climate uncertainty, also other uncertainties, we need to adapt our conservation strategies. That is the main message on that. Good. So that was the second part. So then I would move on to the third part of my talk. Completely different world. We now move into Central America. The general approach on that, so the motivation of that was that we went into a collaboration with so-called green investment funds. That is what you read. So we worked together with people collecting money from, let's say, rather wealthy people, mostly in Germany, in Central Europe, who are investing in tropical afforestation, mostly with the goal of increasing carbon, but also, and that was important for us, also to produce timber in the long run and to fix the carbon in long-living timber products. And that was the idea. So what we did was we started to collect a lot of data on plantations, mostly in Costa Rica, but also in Panama, very little in other countries, but these are mostly the two countries. And we are, and that was the specificity of this project, also of these investment funds. They do not, well, let's say they have a mixture of some of the fast-growing foreign species like Tictona grandis. So this is usually the cash cow on this type of plantations, but they only include it as one part of the portfolio. For the rest, the 5 other species, you might probably not know the names. So Dipteryx olivera, this is called. So these are all native species. And the interesting thing here, for example, there is Voici included here, Voici guatemalensis. This is a fast-growing pioneer species. And what they did was, in these plantations, they mixed these fast-growing species with the more shade tolerance and with highly valuable but slow-growing shade tolerance, like Dalbergia. So this is the rosewood. Maybe you have seen that. They use it for carving, whenever you can buy the stuff, the artwork at the airport. So the idea is, so not to invest into things like eucalyptus or melina or whatever, but rather take native species, mix the species, and then go also into sort of more uneven aged, close to nature management strategies. And you see here it was quite a lot of work to to calibrate the growth model that we used here. Was a process-based growth model, 3PG, that we for the first time applied really to this type of native mixed species. And that is the initial paper on that. It's a PhD done by Anja Nolte. And then based off that calibrated model, we did additional studies. So for example, here, this was probably the most prominent. That was the last paper of Anja Nolte published in Science Advances, where we indeed detected a sharp decline of the productivity on these plantations when a certain temperature threshold is exceeded. And here the temperature threshold here is a mean temperature of 29 degrees. Sounds very high. Is nothing really very exceptional in these countries. There is a small map of this isthmus here. So under an SSP 337, you would find it quite common in this area. So under climate change, which means that even these tropical forests that are really have a very high dynamics of forest growth, when a certain threshold is exceeded, they go down. And that is something that is, I would say, in general, not really properly taken into account when people invest in these plantations in order to store more carbon in a part of the world where forest growth is really high. So if they take into account the climate change here, they would probably have, let's say, have another strategy for investment, a more robust one. So that is one. We also put an economic part on that. So we had 2 PhDs in that project. The other one is by Arne Pinschmidt. So he looked indeed into sort of, that is a Pareto curve, so an optimal curve that tries to optimize the net present value and the carbon sequestration. That is the right graph here. So in general, the general conclusion from that here is if you look in the left lower part, you have the monocultures, especially when you plant monocultures on the slow-growing, shade-tolerant ones, the productivity will be very low, both in terms of net present value, economic, but also in terms of accumulated carbon. In the middle, and that was astonishing for us, is a monoculture of Tictona grandis that is supposed to be the cash cow. Normally, in this type of, it's a foreign species coming from East Asia, being imported into Central America. But what you see is on the upper right graph, when you mix these species in an intelligent way, mixing the pioneers, mixing the more shade-tolerant and the slow-growing ones, this is where you really get first the highest net present values, but you also get, let's say, much more carbon accumulate, because of course these pioneer species have a much faster growth. So
Marc, il y a une question en
Yes.
ligne. Marie-Thérèse?
Yes.
Oui, Bonjour, j'aimerais juste que vous reveniez sur ce diapo. Est-ce que vous dites que la diversité des cultures est mieux pour la séquestration de carbone que la monoculture ou bien?
Oui, c'est ça. Ça, c'était la conclusion qu'on avait de là,
Ok,
quand on fait le mélange des espèces, quand on a des pionniers ensemble avec ceux qui tolèrent un plus d'ombre, on a à la fin un taux élevé de carbone qui est fixé. Oui,
ok. Donc, on est mieux de diversifier pour avoir plus de séquestration de carbone. Ok,
exact.
merci.
Ouais. Okay, and then a third PhD that has been conducted was by Lukas Baumbach. He was using a so-called DGVM, so a dynamic global vegetation model. And the dynamic global vegetation model, that is a model that works on a higher scale. It doesn't work on a single plantation as we had in the first case. It rather works on the level of, let's say, a subcontinent. In this case, a subcontinent consists of the isthmus of Central America, reaching from Honduras over Nicaragua into Costa Rica, Panama, and even parts of Colombia. Yeah, so this you see is in the middle. And these DGVMs, these vegetation models, they usually do not work on single species, but they work on plant functional types. So we have to group first the different species into plant functional types, and then you make projections over the time. A bit similar to the species distribution models that we did. So this is the first paper that Lukas published. What he was showing, there's two conclusions. First of all, when you look into these small figures, so we have the present climate on top, and then we have three different climate scenarios. These are the RCPs, so the latest at the time being. What you see here is we see suitability changes for these plant functional types. And these suitability changes, they're not only losers, they're also winners. They go in favor of the generalists. So plant functional types, let's say groups of species that are able to adapt to changing conditions, they are favored against the specialists. So the specialists, mostly the specialists that are adapted to, let's say, humid conditions, cooler conditions, they will, I would say, decrease. And that has two effects. The first one is what we lose. You see it when you look on the right side of these graphs. You see the present climate, and you see here the latitude and the altitude. You see what we observe is the habitat connectivity will be reduced. So there will be sort of split off into isolated habitats because these specialists need specific habitats. And if they're getting smaller, they lose the connectivity, which has disadvantages for the dispersal of the species. So you lose areas, you lose the connectivity. That's the one thing. The second one is, and that is something that is even worse, is you see that on the lower graph to the right, they have, of course, some ability, especially the specialists, to move further up. So to move towards the top of the mountains, but at one point this is being stopped because you cannot move further up than the summit of the mountain. So these upslope shifts, as we have observed them, they then bear the risk of what we call mountaintop extinction. So at one point, if the species are adapted to cooler conditions, at one point there is an end to the upslope shift, and then they die out. And this is the first thing that we see. You see these gray areas. These are the habitats that are being lost at the time being. So this was these were the two major conclusions that we had from this DGVM. We made a second investigation based on that, where I'm not getting into the details here, where we indeed made sort of an economic valuation of the change of these habitats, of the change of this biome stability, as we call it. So we have a reduced stability. So we used LPG gas in this time, so this dynamic vegetation model. We looked into the biome stability, into CO2 sequestration. We then made an economic valuation not only for timber, or we left the timber out. We assumed that management is not the main issue here. There are other ecosystem services. And what we did was we looked into existing studies of the valuation of this ecosystem. And then we made what we call a benefit transfer. Yeah, so we looked into the values that came out of the other studies. We discounted them to the point in time where we made our investigation. And that when what we see here is on the right side, there's quite some high costs related to that, loss of biome stability and the loss of the CO2. So especially in the drier region that are today already suffering from dry periods, they lose quite a lot of their ecosystem services. And we got into figures like also when you discount that far into the future back, that can also can go into the billions of euros on yearly loss of value of ecosystem services due to climate change impact. That was a study we published in Nature Communications. We got into some discussions with colleagues, economic colleagues, saying, oh no, your interest rate is wrong, the valuation is wrong. Well, this is something that happens, but we still think that it holds true. And the interesting thing here is also in the end, when you look into the far future, that is one conclusion also here. The value of the carbon that is concentrated in this forest becomes almost, let's say, negligible. So what the main value is really the value of the ecosystem services that you lose there. Could be not only recreation services, but we also, let's say, valuated sort of biodiversity, which is demanding. Yeah. So, and timber didn't play a role at all. Yeah, so the loss here in this very rich ecosystem service is mostly in these forest ecosystems is clearly not in the timber. And what was also a bit surprising to us, not really into the carbon, it's into the other ecosystems that you lose there. Okay, I think I move to my last part.
2 minutes.
Yes.
Or 5 minutes.
Yeah, I speed up a bit. And I get into 4 scale. I can do this very quickly. Yeah. So 4 scale is an international research training group between Canada and Germany. The project is about to start around next month. He's one of the partners. So we will have a group of 10 PhDs from Germany, a similar group in Canada, and we will work on scale effects in the forest adaptation. This is a bit what I'm not going to read through all that. There's very specific things in the 2 countries that we try to see the benefits. So for example, in Germany, it's rather the small scale and the community forest. In Canada, for example, it's this indigenous perspective that we do not have at all. And I think we will put the students together and they should learn from each other. The whole thing and that is the name, is structured on different spatial scales from the tissue to the stand. And we also have this feedback loops on the different scales that we try to look into in more detail. These scales, you see them, there's a governance scale from the individual to the legislation, so to the whole nation if you want to. And there's an ecological scale reaching from the genes, the omics, to the whole region, from the tree, over the tree, the stand, and the landscape. And this is what I put in. For me, the interesting is, as an economist, is the forest enterprise. This is where decisions on management are being taken and includes basically from the tree to the region. So that is the management scale. There is 4 different topics. So there is adaptation and resilience. There's ecosystem processes and services, forest management. This is a bit in the center. We want to influence also forest management, but there's also governance and social economics. And then there will be some cross-scale integration. Here you see this is just stylized. So the blue ones are the German ones, just as an example of this topic 1, the resilience and adaptation, how many of these projects are. So in Canada, you have also postdoc projects. We usually in Germany only have PhD projects. just one example of a project of this. This would be phenotypic adaptation at the wood to tree scale. This is Thomas Seifert on the left, together with Axel Albrecht on the right, and a Canadian partner. So we look into what happens on spatial tree competition under climate change and the adaptation. A second example, I am involved in that is management forest transformation on the standard enterprise scale. I'm working together with a practitioner on the right and a Canadian colleague in the middle. How can we develop robust management strategies? So that is the idea of this project. And then another one where Frederic is involved. This is on serious games. So I'm really interested to see what's going up here. So we have mental models. Maybe you can say something on the project. I will not get into the details. This is also serious gaming, something that we also use for lecturing, for teaching. But what you see here is from the overview, that is a very wide scale of different projects working together under a common topic. I will skip that one here. Just these research and training groups, they have, apart from the scientific part, also there's many other goals. So they should be technical skills, they have professional skills, they are trained. We will send the Germans to Canada and the Canadians to Germany. We will mix the groups. So there should be interdisciplinary research. Early career research are a big topic. And so that is a bit the plan. So this is the different cohorts of the Canadians. They will be in Germany, and then the Germans will be in Canada. Okay, so that was a bit a ride through to keep in time. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Marc. Je vais prendre les questions. Alors, qui veut commencer? Ah, il y en a une en ligne. Oui, Assouman.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was quite interesting. I have a question, please. You made mention of fast-growing species plus native species put together. To be precise, you made mention of Melina and the teak.
Yeah.
With the time, will the volume remain constant or it will decrease over years?
Of the plantations, you mean?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Like the mixture of growing species and native species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We will not use Melina. Melina was an example of a species that we didn't use because it's a foreign species there. So we replaced it by a native species that is this Voici. The thing is, the growing stock, the standing volume of the plantations, that depends very much on, first of all, on which time scale you observe that. So if you have a lot of the pioneer species like Voici, they grow really very fast. You will have in very short term a very high volume. So they reach within 6-7 years a height of 15-20 meters. We have observed that. That very much depends on that. And if you admix many of the very slow growing Dalbergia, for example, the volume will be rather low. So it's the art of that is to mix all of them. Clearly, it is not a good strategy only to put the slow growing shade tolerant species in these plantations. And it grows so slow that none of the investors will ever see any return on investment. So the idea is to start with the fast growing ones, to harvest them early and then give space to the more shade tolerant landers like Dipteryx. Dipteryx is very interesting species. It's called the tonka bean. So that's a species that also produce fruits. There's parrots that are depending on this tree. So you have biodiversity included in that. We're trying to evaluate also the biodiversity there and maybe also generate money on that. Is that an answer to the question?
I guess yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
D'autres questions, Claudie?
So what's your thoughts on assisted migration in order to deal better with climate change and also terror?
Yeah, that's a very hot topic.
Yeah.
First of all what I've shown here, so this move of the tree species over time in Europe, This is unthinkable without assisted migration, because you cannot expect that an oak tree will migrate within 30 years from Germany to Poland or whatever. So this is all, there's all an assumption behind assisted migration, that somebody is active. So observing the state of the forest, seeing, oh, there is a decline, or even what is much better is to be proactive and planting the tree before all the others have died. Yeah, using the shade. Assisted migration is insofar a critical topic if you introduce species that have an invasive potential. Yeah, for example, there's a lot of dreaming about Douglas fir in Germany right now. We think the Douglas fir can one-to-one replace the Novus spruce. Clearly not. Yeah, we can admix the Douglas fir. We see that it's getting problem. It doesn't have the insect problem. It's already getting problems on dry sites. I think when we talk about assisted migration, we always have to look into, let's say, a diversification. So we need to keep as many native species as possible, use other native species, try to plant them on spots where they haven't been before, yeah, which can cause problems. For example, we were using beech varieties of Southern Europe, of Calabria. We planted them in Southwest Germany. What happened in the first winter? They died of frost. We have the extremes on both sides, so the cold one and the warm one. So that is something that we really have to steer carefully. We're getting a lot of questions from our practitioners saying, hey, should we plant now all the Mediterranean oaks? I mean, if I look in your graph and I say, sorry, be careful. I mean, if you get below -5, -10, they will die. There's no use. So you need to be really, this is something that has to be really carefully steered, but clearly without assisted migration, I think that a transformation of the forests towards more climate adapted forests is not possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to take the example of the mixed species plantations in Central America, and all the results from 3DFNet in Europe showing that mixed species plantations are like a good alternative to improve the resilience of the forest. And you're showing in the models that with the actual the past like silviculture practices, like the forests are not going well, but still we don't see the changes. Like 3DFNet is like trying to push the changes in the silvicultural practices in Europe or in North America, and nothing is happening. Even you are showing that monetary, the problems are really, really bad. So what else? What we can do?
So the point you are touching on is nature is very complicated. So forests are immensely complex ecosystems, but it's getting really chaotic when human beings are involved. That is the main issue. So if you do not, let's say, get into the heads of the people and understand what they are thinking, what the preferences are, and if you're not able to convince the people, especially all the private forests, you will not be successful. So clearly this one here is not a natural science problem. It is a combined problem of social ecological systems, where unfortunately the social part is the dominating one, because this is where the decisions are taken. Yeah. So that is why all the projects we are doing, and this applies to this 4-scale projects, we now gained a huge cluster of excellence. It's always a mixture between social sciences and natural sciences. You can do beautiful modeling, but your models are useless if you cannot convince the people that they have to change something. And the first change has to happen in the heads of the people. Yeah. So which means, and that very much depends on how are the perceptions of the people? Did they perceive something that they see as a threat? I mean, people like the president of your neighboring state is not helpful on that, saying everything is okay, there is no climate change. But the thing is, you need to bring the thing in the head of the people, and then you can start really doing things. And unfortunately, you're right here. Well, in Germany, we are trying to do this transformation since about 50 years, I would say now. But you still have seen the results. I mean, also forest ecosystems are slow-moving systems. So once you have installed a status, you're going to have it for decades. Yeah. But I think that the crucial thing is you need to convince the people. And if you're not successful in that, your beautiful model will be of nowhere. Yeah.
D'autres questions? Je sais pas, tu peux-tu me dire? Ah, il reste 5 minutes. Fred, vas-y.
Yeah, I don't know if you could get back to that corridor, biodiversity corridor study, because you were showing what kind of silvicultural scenario would be contributing. I think, yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
That would be contributing to maintaining the ability of the corridor to be robust to.
I think it's mostly the no management. So you need to take out more trees and you need to let the tree die, because this is on saproxylic beetles. They are feeding on dead wood. So you need to increase, in that case, the amount of dead wood. And that is why.
Okay. So it's very specific to the dead wood, this one. Because I would have thought that selection cutting could also help in adapting the forest.
True.
And that adaptation factor is not taken into account here, if I understand.
Yeah.
Right.
There is both in that. The problem with this selection cutting is that you deliberately take out the big trees. I mean, this is what we do in uneven age management. We start with the big trees and let the small trees grow. You can do this to a certain extent. You have to do this to maintain the forest, but on the other hand, in the light of this specific goal of the study, it was indeed increasing the no management part. But the no management part, I mean, this is sort of a robust optimization. There's an objective function behind that also includes the net present value, which means that, let's say, no management in the whole area will not deliver you sort of an optimal solution. So you have to balance that. You have to balance the trade-offs. Yeah, but in that case, you see that. And no management, it doesn't mean no management for large blocks here, but no management intelligently distributed in the landscape, in this forest landscape. That has, let's say, 2,500-3,000 hectares, this forest landscape. Yeah. So that's a bit the idea. But I admit that this is, it's a model study. It's a stylized landscape. These are true forests behind, but we were testing. Yeah, and the main idea was to show that the standard optimization based on operations research with linear programming, that doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work, clearly, no. So you need to include the uncertainties and you need to look for some robust optimization. And there you get a different pattern, and there you have to give up economic productivity, net present value. So that is the main, I would say, saying on that.
Good. I think we reached 10.
There's 2 ones.
Oui, OK. Ah, il y a 2 questions en ligne. Ah, pardon. On va prendre les 2 dernières en ligne. Donc, je ne sais pas qui était en premier. Yam?
Yes.
C'est qui ça? Yam, je ne sais pas c'est quoi le nom, mais...
Oui.
Pardon.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui, bonjour, c'est Steven Yamasaki. Thank you very much for your presentation. My question actually relates to this slide. Could you say a few words about how you evaluate robustness?
Yes. Robustness is a technology. First of all, what you do is you produce a probability density function by multiple repetition of management strategies under changing climate scenarios, price scenarios, cost scenarios. Right. And then you look into the probability density function, and what you don't do is that you say, okay, I'm looking into the optimum as the mean value of this probability density function. Right. A robust strategy would be a strategy that also works under worst case scenarios. And there you set a threshold, and the economists usually set one threshold saying, okay, we need to choose, this is an example, but you're free to choose a threshold that works even under the 5% worst case scenario. So that would be a threshold that we would call the so-called value at risk. So that would be one robustness criterion. So a management strategy that works even if 95% are worse or are better. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The second one, if you go to and that is very much linked to risk aversion. So you can even move further to the left side of the distribution. That would be then the conditional value at risk. That would be the mean value between the absolute worst case and the 5% threshold. So these are 2 robustness matrix that we now as a standard apply when we interpret these probability density functions. But there are many more. Yeah, but these are now two. Usually robustness means you do not go for a classical optimum, but you rather go for something that is, let's say, satisfying or sufficing. There's even a term, a specific term. Let's say sufficing, something that let's say fulfills a minimum of your goal. Yeah. So that would be a robustness metric. But in general, there are many. There's a big research on, we for example, we go into spatial robust optimization, taking also into account spatial aspects. But the main idea is looking for solutions that also work, even the worst case takes place.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Émile?
I was wondering at one point, and I think it was the third project you present, you used the term adaptive management.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is it more of an active management, or or is it more of a passive management? Do you have applied many experiments? Or is it just one big treatment that you apply everywhere?
No. Adaptation means you go for a large variety of potential different management strategies. So you never have one thing that you apply over the whole landscape. That would be, I mean, this picture of this last one is a bit like you always need to have sort of a pattern of different management distributed over the landscape, including no management, also including more intensified management, changing tree species. But it's also, I would rather say, a portfolio of management strategies, but we never get into one single adaptation option over a whole landscape. Yeah.
Thanks for the precision. Okay, sorry.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup, Marc. On va terminer avec ça. Merci beaucoup tout le monde de votre présence. Bravo.